Well, thank you very much. I hope that you enjoyed that overview of the Khaya Lum project, which I think is a real demonstration of the values and the ideals of the Free Market Foundation. So the Free Market Foundation is a think tank dedicated to the promotion of individual liberty, economic freedom in a true sense, not the economic freedom that perhaps the economic freedom fighters have in mind, real durable economic freedom. And so we're a think tank. We conduct a lot of research, a lot of policy analysis and advocacy in the media. But we're also a do tank. We want our values to come alive for ordinary South Africans. Ultimately, what we want to see is South Africans from all walks of life enjoying the fruits of freedom. So I just wanted to extend a very special thank you to Dave Stewart and the FW de Klerk Foundation, as well as to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. I think that you're doing incredible work, and I think this conference is very important and necessary discussion as we deal with the risk of expropriation without compensation. But I also want to remind the audience here of the benefits of private property rights, why private property rights are worth defending in the first place. And I think I'll discuss some basic history of the Khaya Lum project, and then we'll kind of unpack why we think this is an important initiative. So as I mentioned in the video, around 2010 or so, the idea began germinating for a project of this kind. There was a recognition that although the end of apartheid had kind of ushered in a more durable private property rights framework, that many former council tenants didn't really have the formal recognition of their ownership status. And that was seen as a problem. So many individuals or families had been often living in a household for sometimes generations, decades at a time, but they didn't have any documentary evidence of their ownership status. And so even though with the passage of the Ultra Act, the Upgrading of Land Tenure Rights Act after the transition, there was still this bottleneck. And essentially that bottleneck was caused by municipalities that didn't have the capacity to issue these title deeds. So the Khaya Lum project, through that initial germination period up until 2013, as I mentioned, when the first 100 title deeds were transferred, and that was very symbolic because that was 100 years after the Native Lands Act. I think the kind of background to that, I think, was very important. So this was the coming together of donors. So First National Bank was one of the original instigators of the project, and obviously this kind of preceded my time at the Free Market Foundation. But many specific individuals, Terry Markman is here today, the late Perry Feldman, they were instrumental in catalyzing this project. And essentially how the Khaya Lum project works is we engage with potential donors who provide the initial capital for a specific project. We identify an area. So we've been mostly active in the Free State, in Ngwati municipality. Many of you will be familiar with Parys, Viljoenskroon, Kroonstad, those kind of areas, Vredefort. And, that was for circumstantial reasons. So the late Perry Feldman, who I mentioned, was residing there. Searle and Lorna Sachs, who are very instrumental in this project, are still very active there. And essentially how it works is we will approach a municipality to say, this is the service we would like to offer. We would like to facilitate the transfer of these title deeds. We will work together with conveyancers who will do the legal legwork there. And then we will identify the beneficiaries. There is a verification process that has to happen, often quite extensive. This is often very kind of practical, getting your hands dirty kind of work. So, for example, in Ngwati, what often happens is we've hired the services of a gentleman with a loudhailer who drives around in a bakkie telling people, hey, listen, you can potentially be a beneficiary of this program. If you sign up with us, you can get a title deed. So this is not the usual work of a think tank, but I think it's very important and necessary. And then this all culminates in a title deed handover ceremony, a transfer ceremony, and you saw some of the scenes there. And really, this is an incredibly emotional moment for everybody who's involved. There's, I think, a lot of bureaucracy and red tape that needs to be cut to get to that moment. But I've often been struck by just how much buy-in we have from the municipalities. There's, I think, a political dividend that many of the local politicians yield from that, so they're very keen to support that. And even though the Free Market Foundation is an advocate of limited government and sometimes is very critical of government, we are not anti-government, and we recognize that the municipalities themselves have a really important role to play in this process and in providing that initial legal recognition. And so I think the benefits of this are really very obvious, but I think it's still worth spelling them out. So I think that firstly, there's the economic benefit. I think traditionally the so-called land restitution programs, the land reform programs have been very state-led. And what we've seen with many of the kind of land transfer processes that have happened, that have been led by the state, is that there's a kind of lack of economic incentives to, these are productive farms that are taken out of a productive activity, then transferred to what is often a rightful beneficiary, but they don't necessarily have the skills or the capacity to do that. So in this sense, I mean, we're dealing mostly with kind of urban and peri-urban homes, but you avoid the tragedy of the commons. As somebody who is a rightful property owner, they have an incentive to upgrade that property, to invest productively in that property. And they can do so because they know that if there was any challenge to their ownership status, if there was a dispute over their property, then they would be able to enforce that through the power of the law. And so that gives them the certainty, the long-term view to make those long-term commitments. I think also very importantly, given the history of land dispossession in South Africa, that this gives particularly black property owners a sense of dignity, agency, that they have the same rights as somebody in the suburbs, for example. And it also, very importantly, I think, gives people the comfort that the next generation and the generations after that will benefit from the wealth that they've worked so hard to build and from those assets. And so intergenerational wealth transfer, I think, is a very important aspect of private property rights and the Khaya Lum project as well. And, we're very proud of the fact that we have helped to transfer 10,000 title deeds since the inception of this project. 3,000 of those were last year. But really, if you think about that, if you equate roughly back of the envelope, one property as being worth approximately 100,000 rand, and you multiply that by 10,000, that's R1 billion worth of latent capital that has been unlocked, and that's really profound. But, we also have to be honest with ourselves and say, well, this is really a drop in the ocean. And there's still huge unmet demand. Some of our sponsors have actually expressed an interest in doing some kind of study, which might be a bit of an academic exercise, but trying to quantify what the extent of the demand is. So there's all of those economic benefits. There's also, of course, the ability to use your property as collateral to take out a loan, to start a business. You know that if there is an economic opportunity in, say, another city or town, you can leave your property and you can go in and take up that job with the comfort and the knowledge that when you return 6 months later to your property, and perhaps there's somebody there who's trying to lay claim to it, you at least have some kind of mechanism to protect your asset. And I think also when we talk about all of these economic arguments, I mean, if you look at the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World Index, all of the countries that are in the top quartile of that index have some kind of property rights protections. And there is a very strong correlation between economic freedom, private property ownership, and prosperity. So there is a developmental argument for this, which is very clearly shown in the data. But we would say that even if there wasn't an economic benefit, we would still do this project, because ultimately it is a recognition of the rights of all South Africans. And you know, John Locke, the famous liberal philosopher, English philosopher, you know, he spoke about natural rights and the right that you have over yourself. And that right also extends to other subsidiary rights. So this right of self-ownership, I think, also extends to your right to own property and to enjoy the fruits of your labor as well. So, you know, I think when you think about South Africa's civil society and our democracy as well, there is also this democratic aspect to property ownership that, you know, without assets and land, that is necessarily a limitation on civil society. Civil society without enforceable rights is essentially made of straw. So, you know, I think in the political discourse, and particularly kind of the kind of ANC, a kind of hegemonic language, you know, often talks about the right to housing, and that is almost framed in a kind of socio-economic sense, that everybody needs a roof over their head, and certainly shelter is very important. But you know, everybody in the Soviet Union had a place to live, but they didn't necessarily have a say over where they could live, and ultimately their property rights were controlled by the state. So this Lockean idea of individual ownership, you know, is actually a core pillar of a democratic, free society as well. And your ability to enforce that is really important. So we're not here talking about the right to housing, even though we're very glad to see people having a house. Property ownership is a universal right that extends to all people, and even people who don't own property benefit from this. You know, even if you don't own property, if you're just renting, you know that one day you could, and that also that rising tide lifts all boats as well. So Walter Williams, the African-American economist, you know, he spoke about owners' rights to make decisions about their usage of property, the right to keep and dispose of property as they see fit, and also the right to enjoy an income and to bear the fruits of their property, but also the losses resulting from their economic decisions. And I think you know, that is a really useful framework for thinking about something like the Khaya project. But I just want to say a special word of thanks to everyone who has been involved in the Khaya project. I think it has been truly impactful and a very, I think, symbolic project given the current very fractious political discourse around property. You know, I think we cannot just outsource this to the state. You know, the state has shown itself to have very specific interests and is often acting against the interests of ordinary South Africans. We need to empower ordinary South Africans by diffusing ownership as broadly and widely as possible. So I want to thank the donors who have supported the Khaya project very generously, and all the volunteers, as well as the broader team of conveyancers and other professionals who have made this project possible, and of course all my colleagues at the Free Market Foundation. But that's it from me. I hope that creates a suitable context for the rest of today's discussion, and look forward to the rest of the sessions.